All right. Well, it is the first Wednesday of our new quarter, so as I mentioned before, we are going to study the book of Proverbs. Which I'm excited about because I love the book of Proverbs, and I don't know, I've taught it a couple of different times before at various places. I was trying to remember exactly. In fact, I meant to look this afternoon sometime just to see for my own curiosity, but I think it was not long before we moved to Bremen that I had taught Proverbs in Childersburg. And I came to Bremen, and I'd enjoyed that study, and it was somewhat fresh in my mind, and I was thinking, well, I'd like to teach that at Bremen. And then somebody told me, well, you know, it wasn't that long ago that Sydney taught the book of Proverbs. I thought, well, I better not do that. And so every time a new quarter would roll around, I would think about that, and I'd think, well, I don't want to do Proverbs. And so it had crossed my mind just leading up to this quarter, and I had that thought again. And then I said to myself, well, it's kind of been 12 years, going, just about 4 months from being 13. So I was like, well, I think I'm going to do Proverbs. But this is a familiar book. I don't know. I've seen several writers and just doing some of my studies preparing that make statements like, it's a book that's often overlooked or it's not studied that often. I don't know. I mean, I suppose that might be true in some respects, but as I said, I've taught it a couple of different times. But what I'm going to do that's new to me, and I don't know, some guys, again, in some of my reading, act like it's easier. I've never done it before, so I don't know. I guess I'll let you know when I'm done. But what I want to do is approach it topically. I've done it before, and not here, of course, but in other places, taught through it kind of a verse-by-verse study. But a lot of fellows that I was reading after, they said that's more difficult just because you don't have the paragraph sections and such as much, at least, as in a typical book of the Bible. But I remember part of, I guess, why myself have taught it a couple of different times, and even was going to do it even before, even here. But I remember this class so well. There, you always have those teachers. Memorable teachers. Maybe it might be because of a relationship that you had with the teacher. You were closer to them. It might be just a very unique teaching style. It might be several factors, a combination of factors. But I had Curtis Cates for wisdom literature, I think was the name of the class, as it was at the preaching school. And Brother Cates was notoriously difficult to get notes from. I mean, just something about the way he taught. It was extremely difficult to take notes. And I remember when I had him for the first class, I think it was like third quarter of first year before you ever have him. It wasn't wisdom literature, it was a different class. But I remember asking a couple of my roommates who were second year students, 2 or 3 classes in, I'm getting concerned because I don't really have very many notes. And I said, guys, is there some kind of trick, secret here to getting better notes from Brother Cates? And they said, no, you won't. So you just can't take notes from him. They said, but you'll remember. And man, I'm telling you, they were not kidding, because especially with the book of Proverbs, there are times I'm reading it. I may go to a verse and studying for another class or another sermon, maybe just in my daily reading, and not just, remember, but many times it's like I can hear him in my mind. Sometimes I can see him with some of his wild gestures and such, teaching that particular verse, that particular proverb. It's a great, great study. I have my notes from, I guess they're from preaching school, that Proverbs has been referred to and certainly could be classified as the oldest, most authoritative, and most practical book on ethics that the world ever has or will know. When we say proverb, of course, there's the book of Proverbs, but it's called that because it is a collection of proverbs. It's not just proverbs, and I guess this is where we need to define that word. What do we mean by that? How would anyone in particular define a proverb? A wise saying. They're typically remembered for what? The wisdom, obviously, it being a wise saying. But what else do we typically think of when we think of a proverb? Memorable.
Packed with meaning.
Yeah, they usually kind of pack a punch, and sometimes it's, get on your toes a little bit, but it makes the point, and that's kind of what a proverb does. They don't pull punches when it comes to proverbs. But yeah, memorable, that was something I had in my notes as far as when I think of a proverb, you think of things that are memorable. What else? That was the other thing I was looking for. Concise. Very to the point, short, concise statements. And that really is how I've got down here short, clever saying, offering wisdom. That really kind of hits on a lot of what we said there. Most of these are in the center section of the book, chapters 10 through 29 or so. It's not to say those other chapters and sections don't have any, but you'll see, and when we get into the introduction, you'll see that a little bit more. But there's a lot more to the book than just these little short, concise, memorable sayings. And here's the thing. We are all familiar with Proverbs. Not necessarily talking about the book, but with Proverbs in general, whether we realize it or not. Sometimes you might say to somebody, can you think of a proverb? And they say, no, I can't think of any at all. But if you say something like, Mama always said, you lay down with the dogs, you're going to rise up with fleas, right? That's a proverb. A lot of us heard that growing up. People still say that. Sometimes people will say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Was it Little Richard's Almanac that's just filled with them? I'm thinking of. Not Little Richard, that was it. Yeah, that's different. Little Richard's totally different. I don't know, no offense to him, but I don't know how much wisdom he dispensed in his time, but very different. Poor Richard's Almanac. Good night. So, an ounce of provision is worth a pound to cure. Sometimes we'll say it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. That's a proverb. My grandmother Campbell was full of proverbs. Before I could have ever even told you what a proverb is, I knew a bunch of them because of spending time with grandmother. And sometimes she had some that were the strangest things. This came up recently. It might have been, I don't know, I want to say it might have been when Joshua and Maddie were at the house recently, and because Maddie was just kind of like, what? But grandmother, I don't even know how it led into it, but grandmother had this one that just sticks in my mind all the time because it was so odd to me. But if a lady, or a female in general, ever whistled, she would give this proverb. Did any of y'all know this? You know, April? Okay. It's one of the strangest things I've ever heard. She would say, of course, she would get on to, one time my sister whistled about something, and she said, don't do that. We're kind of like, what? And she says, Mama always said, a whistling girl and a crowing hen always comes to some bad end. And I said, now, grandmother, you're going to have to run that by me again. But that was a proverb she would often repeat. I don't know, can anybody think of an example of one you got just from everyday life?
Early to bed.
What is it? Early to bed, early to rise. Makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. I've heard that before, and I was trying to remember all the details of it. Yeah, that's a good example of a proverb. Yes, sir.
You got to be tough. You're going to be stupid.
I was 25 years old when I realized.
I don't. I'm sure I had to have heard that as a younger kid, but Jacob Rutledge and I were talking one day about our boys, Joshua and Jake, being about the same age, and we were talking about this, and he said that's something he'd tell Jake sometimes. Boy, if you're going to be dumb, you better be tough. And so I can't tell you how many times, Jacob, I've said that to my boys, and it's true. There's some truth to that. That would be a proverb. To fail to plan is plan to fail. That's another one of those. There are also, by the way, other proverbs in the Bible that are not just in the book of Proverbs. You see several in Ecclesiastes, as you would expect, being written by Solomon. But let me get somebody to grab 1 Kings 20, verse 11. You see a proverb here. And then, who wants that one, by the way? Okay, Bob's going to get that one. And then somebody else, Luke 6:39. Billy, thank you. All right, Bob, whenever you get there, just go ahead, please.
And the king of Israel answered and said, Tell them, let not him that girds on his armor boast himself as he that puts it off.
Here's this fellow that says to King of Israel, hey, let's meet face to face, meaning he wants to go to battle, wants to fight. And he says, the fellow that's putting on his armor ought not to be boasting like the one that's taking it off. In other words, you're taking it off, you're back home safe. Battle's over. He says, you're boasting like somebody that's back home about to relax and the battle's over and you're wanting to fight. There was a fellow, I was trying to think, might have been, I don't remember. It might have been Tommy South, who has a good electronic book on Proverbs, or it might have been in Josh Posey's material. Josh, not terribly long ago, did a series on Proverbs, and he shared that material with me, and so it might have been in there. But one fella kind of paraphrased that from 1 Kings 20 as, don't count your chickens before they hatch. So it's kind of a proverb there. Luke 6:39. Bill, you got it?
And he spake also a parable unto them. Can the blind guide the blind? Shall they not both fall into a pit?
If the blind lead the blind, then they're both going into a pit, or both going to go off into the ditch. And then there's another one. We could list others, but I just had just a few of these to give you some illustration of those that are outside the actual text of Proverbs. But another one is Acts 20, verse 35. Paul is actually quoting Jesus there, and he says that Jesus taught him it's more blessed to give than to receive. Well, that'd be kind of a proverbial statement. I think it's Luke 4 when Jesus himself says, you'll no doubt say to me this proverb, physician, heal thyself. So even there he mentions a proverb that was well known to his audience. So a lot of different proverbs in the Bible. But as is obvious from some of these that we've mentioned here, and we could even just keep going around the room, and we could probably go on for the rest of class and plenty more than that, just with familiar proverbs that most, if not all of us, have heard before. And that illustrates what Bob was pointing out. They lend themselves very well to recollection and even memorization, because they're just the way it's put, you remember it. And some of the, sometimes I'll talk about Brother Brinkley, and I call them Brinkleyisms, and some of them were so memorable and are so memorable to me because a lot of them would be put almost as if in Proverbs. I don't know if they would classify as Proverbs per se, but sometimes just the way something is worded, and that's kind of how Proverbs are. Dating this book, as far as, we often introduce a book, we talk about when was it written. It's nearly impossible with Proverbs because it's a collection of Proverbs. It's a collection of, sometimes you have poems and Proverbs within those poems, but the collection, they've been collected over such a long time that so many various times, it's just difficult to date the book. Oh, by the way, I just saw something I left out of my notes. Talking about Proverbs lend themselves well to recollection and memorization, and that certainly is true. But again, thinking about all those various Proverbs we talked about from, secular walks, from secular sources at least, when it comes to the book of Proverbs, remember that these are more than just catchy, memorable sayings. What they are is their divine guidance to live the best life and to interact in the best possible way with our fellow man, with our families, and so on. So don't lose sight of that. Yeah, some of them are very memorable and catchy, but they're also their guidance from heaven. Spirit-inspired words to lead us to the best life possible. But again, dating the book's nearly impossible. Even if you say, okay, we want to date the collation or the writing of the book itself, that even is difficult because you have, like in chapter 1, verse 1, it mentions the Proverbs of Solomon. But when you get to chapter 25, verse 1, it's going to talk about Proverbs of Solomon that the men of Hezekiah copied. So it seems that a lot of this has been kind of being collected, not all at once necessarily, but at some point it's, again, Spirit-inspired and written down. But it's interesting to me that statement, the Proverbs of Solomon, sayings of Solomon that the men of Hezekiah copied, it's at least 250 years. Some writers have it about 270 years after Solomon. And there are these Proverbs that have been most likely repeated, and these men of Hezekiah sit down and copy them out. In fact, a lot of commentators speculate men of Hezekiah there a reference to Isaiah and some other prophets. Of course, Isaiah was contemporary with Hezekiah. So possibly, we don't know that for sure, but it is certainly possible. Now, literary characteristics of the book, you'll see several things that, again, we may not necessarily know it by name. When we say Hebrew parallelism, you see a lot of that in this book of Proverbs because it's Hebrew poetry, and that's a staple of Hebrew poetry. And we may not recognize it by that name, but you'll recognize some of these things within when you see some of these verses. Let me get a few readers. I'll just get each person to do two passages because they're all pretty close together. So let me get somebody to. Well, I'll tell you, there are three different kinds. Let me just say that. I'm gonna kind of. There's a lot of different ways you can classify the Hebrew parallelism, but let's think of it in terms of three major types of that. What we would call synonymous, antithetical, and synthetic. And when you say synonymous, it's you have one line or one clause that says something, and then the second line or the second clause basically repeats it. Synonymous. Antithetical, you hear the anti in there. You have two lines or two clauses that are kind of in juxtaposition. There's a contrast made there. And then the synthetic is where the second clause develops or maybe expands upon the thought of the first clause. Now, to give you just a couple of examples of each, Brother Chris, Proverbs 19:29, and then another one in 22. So you may just hold your spot at 22. Brother Robert, just lost my place. Chapter 11, verse 13, and the other one's in 13. Scott, are you going to read one? 16:32, and then the other reference is chapter 20. So Chris will read us 2 verses, and these will show examples of the second clause kind of repeating the thought from the first clause. So, what did I say? 1929.
Judgments are prepared for scoffers and beatings for the backs of fools.
Judgment for scoffers, beatings for the backs of fools. Very, very similar idea there, just being basically repeated. Chapter 22, verse 24.
Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go.
Angry man, furious man, make no friendship, don't go with him. You see how that's very synonymous. So that's an example of that synonymous parallelism. Then chapter 11, verse 13, is that Robert?
A talebearer revealeth secrets, but he that is of a faithful spirit concealeth the matter.
So you see antithetical, a contrast there. A talebearer revealing secrets, faithful person concealing the matter. Chapter 13, verse 9.
13 verse 9. A hypocrite with his mouth destroyeth his neighbor, but through knowledge shall the just be delivered.
All right, the hypocrite and the just kind of put in opposition to one another. So you see that antithetical parallelism. And then Scott, 1632.
Whoever is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit than he who takes a city.
All right, so that's very close to synonymous parallelism, and sometimes you see a lot of similarity between them. Then chapter 20, verse 2.
The terror of a king is like the growling of a lion. Whoever provokes him to anger forfeits his life.
The terror of a king, and then he expands on that and says, you provoke him to anger, you must not be too crazy about living a very comfortable life, or maybe even living at all. So you see the idea there, that the synonymous, the repeating, perhaps in slightly different wording, the two concepts put in opposition, and then expanding the thought. The book of Proverbs has never had any real serious question as far as its place in the Bible. Is it inspired of God? Does it belong in the canon of Scripture? Never any real question about that. And here's the thing that I always think of when I think about that when it comes to the book of Proverbs. Who could question the inspiration of this book? Because the wisdom that is in this book could only come from one source. There's no way a human could sit down and write this kind of just perfect wisdom. Purpose of the book. Touched on it just a little bit already. Is to tell us in very direct ways, very direct terms, how to live wisely and to avoid behavior that leads to harm, both here and, of course, in the hereafter. Tommy South, I mentioned he has this book, and the way it sounds in the intro, I've got it on my computer, but it sounds like in the introductory part of the book that he just published it electronically. I don't think there's a hard copy unless you print one. But he summarizes the message of Proverbs with the title of his book. And the title of his book is, Don't Be Dumb. I kind of like that. And as he points out, our politically correct society may kind of cringe at that. Oh, I don't know about that. But as he says, Proverbs doesn't spare our feelings using terms like fool, sluggard, adulteress, scoffer, simple, and so on. Lazy man, Proverbs is not trying to tiptoe around our feelings. We said it in the earlier part of the class. Sometimes these are short, concise statements that kind of get on your toes, and they're not always pleasant, but they make us think. And that's sort of the idea. He goes on to say, don't choose a path that doesn't lead where you want to end up. Look beyond what's right here in front of us to longer term results. And that's difficult to do. And, we sometimes say, what's the difference between a wise man and a foolish man? Sometimes it's the difference between a young man and an old man. But I tell you something, wisdom has nothing to do with age. It's everything to do with maturity, spiritual maturity, overall maturity, and having that wisdom. There are young people sometimes that are a lot wiser than some, what we would call elderly people. And there are some older folks that are fools because they don't follow God's teaching. So it has nothing to do with age, and I like that title, Don't Be Dumb. But sometimes we're constantly trying to, it may be our children, it may be other folks, we're saying, look beyond just what's right in front of you to the longer term. And that is what wisdom does. I mean, that's it's not the only way to define wisdom, but that is a part, at least, of defining wisdom, is looking beyond what's just right here, thinking about what's down the road, and being able to foresee danger, to avoid that, but also to make good decisions, to get along with our fellow man, because we have this wisdom that comes only from God. Interesting thing in Proverbs, deeper theological themes, they're not discussed. Many of them are assumed, but they're not discussed. It's all about everyday living, do's, don'ts, to have the best life possible. And that's really what the book is about. It doesn't get any more practical than the book of Proverbs. Some of the basic assumptions in the book, I mentioned some of those themes that are just assumed. The existence of God. Nothing in the book whatsoever that sets out to prove God's existence. It's assumed. It's just something that's assumed. The responsibility of man, the rewards of righteousness, the punishment of wicked. Sometimes those are alluded to, but not really anything you could classify as a discussion of such. They're assumed. There is a specific sense of optimism that is assumed throughout the book. Israel isn't mentioned, nor is the law of Moses, nor any of the great religious or political events of Hebrew history. Sometimes people say, well, how is that? Why? Why would that not be mentioned? Well, I mean, I don't know if we could say with certainty, but it seems that this is written so as to be a collection of timeless proverbs. Not to say that they couldn't be or wouldn't be timeless if they had any of those things mentioned, but without any kind of connection to a specific nation or dispensation of time. Perhaps that's why those things are not mentioned. Maybe they're not mentioned because, again, they're just assumed. It is very difficult to divide this book, as I mentioned earlier. Much of it is the short, concise Proverbs on all kinds of different subjects. And sometimes right within a chapter, sometimes even just right within a couple of different verses, you go from subject to subject. So it is very difficult to outline it or divide it. Others have divided it or outlined it in various ways. But there's a very general outline that I don't know if I've seen it outlined this way, but I like it. I got to looking at it and I was like, this is a pretty good, very basic outline. And I'll show you this. This is in Josh's material that he gave to me. There's this was done by, let's see if I can get this thing to, look at that. See there? This was done by the Bible Project. I tell you, that's not folks that are members of the body of Christ. And so I tell people, you have to filter everything. Of course, anything that's written by a human has to be filtered through the Word of God. But this on Proverbs is pretty good from what I can tell. And I like, as I said, this three-part breakdown. It's very general, this three-part breakdown of the book. If you can't see that, we'll zoom in just a moment for folks that are a little bit further back. And I hope it's going to show up okay. But he breaks it down, or I think it's a couple of different guys that do this, in this threefold division, where you've got chapters 1 through 9. I forget, because I don't think I could do it this way. Yeah, I can. How about that? chapters 1 through 9, and then you got 10 through 29, and then their third section is both of these chapters, 30 and 31. I like it. It's very basic, but it's a good introduction to the book. Now, to get some background, you have to think in terms of Solomon. Solomon, you go all the way back to 1 Kings chapter 3. He's told by God, ask me for whatever you want. God says, or Solomon says, I want wisdom. And God says, since you've asked for that, you didn't ask for long life or wealth or fame or whatever. He says, I'm going to give you more wisdom than any other human. And I'm also going to give you wealth and fame and long life. Of course, he's encouraged to follow the Lord. Solomon got off track. Seems that he did, before the end of his life, get back on the right track. I tend to agree with the assessment of Ecclesiastes as sort of an inspired open letter of repentance from Solomon. Maybe that's just me being optimistic, but I think that you can make a case for that. But he requests wisdom. God grants it. He was exceedingly wise. He wrote some 3,000 Proverbs, 1,000 plus songs. You see this detailed in 1 Kings chapter 4, where it talks there. This is after God grants his request for wisdom. And near the end of that chapter, or right down to the end of the chapter, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding, exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt, for he was wiser than all men. And he mentions several of these different men that he, of course, far excelled in his wisdom. His fame was in all nations round about. Verse 32 says he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spake of trees, from the cedar tree that is in Lebanon, even unto the hyssop that springeth out of the wall. He spake also of beasts, and of fowl, and of creeping things, and of fishes. And there came of all people to hear the wisdom of Solomon, from all kings of the earth, which had heard of his wisdom. People came from all over to hear Solomon's wisdom. And he became kind of the gold standard, right? One fellow put it, I think it was the fellow doing this chart, is the way he put it was, what was the word he used? Fountainhead. The fountainhead of Israel's wisdom literature or wisdom tradition. But I mean, material wisdom pertaining to zoology, botany, entomology, musicology, human relations, all kind of different things. And Adam Clark points out in his commentary, our irony is that we don't really have anything preserved. And I think I was trying to remember the exact way he worded it. I'm probably not going to get it a direct quote, but he says curiosity would trade 3 of the works of Solomon we have now for one on something such as zoology or botany or herbology, whatever. But God has given us what we need, of course, and boy, the wisdom in the book of Proverbs is just, it's unmatched. But he kind of became the fountainhead of that wisdom literature or wisdom tradition. Yes, sir?
He would probably be fired from the university. Now, the reason why I say that is he didn't believe in this secular, sacred distinction. Like people send their kids to Bremen City School to get their book learning and then come to church on Sunday for their spiritual learning. Because if you notice, he studied zoology, botany, and all. And he also believed in God. So there's a lesson for us. We don't really get zoology, botany, and musicology really well together without a reference to a God behind and foundational to those academic studies. And that is one thing we in America need to get squared away, as opposed to secular humanism, which we can study anything we want without reference to God. Proverbs puts it all together.
We sometimes talk about we want kids, I say we. The educational system many times will talk about wanting kids to have such a well-rounded education. The one thing they don't want them taught is about God. And, I always tell people I'm kind of, on the one hand, I don't want a secular institution teaching my children the Bible because that's my job as daddy. The buck stops with me as far as the spiritual training of my children. But it's a mindset, as you said. It's that secular humanistic mindset.
I need to tell you, I got a superintendent to come to my classroom at Rockmart High School and say, we don't want you talking about God. The word may come out sometime, in your speech, but really, we don't want you talking about God. Now, he may have been saying, I don't want you to try to convert people in your classroom, but that's not what he was meaning. I don't want you to include reference to God in things. I want you to talk without that. And I felt like saying, would you please live without breathing?
Yeah. And that's part of Proverbs teaches us that there is no wisdom apart from God. In fact, wisdom begins with, and knowledge begins with, the fear of the Lord. You see that in verse 7. Solomon, by the way, did not write all of the wisdom literature. We've already touched on that a little bit. And Proverbs does not contain just Solomon's words, but he is kind of, as that fellow put it, the fountainhead or where the wisdom tradition or wisdom literature began. But getting back to the introduction part of the book, if I can get to Proverbs, the first 9 verses or so of the book are kind of introductory in nature. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, and judgment, and equity, to give subtlety to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels, to understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. And then he says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of thy father, and forsake not the law of thy mother, for they shall be an ornament of grace unto thy head, and chains about thy neck. So he says, by reading the book, the reader, you and me, we can gain wisdom. And that's something, maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that in another class, but wisdom is attainable. If you're foolish, it's not like you just throw your hands up and say, well, I'm a fool. What can you do? He says you can attain wisdom. And there are also degrees of wisdom. You can grow wiser. But you have to want to. And it requires some things. And so he says the reader can gain wisdom. For most people, wisdom means knowledge. I typically, as I recall it, most of, at least from young adulthood, heard it as knowledge used rightly or knowledge used aright. And I think obviously that's true, but even that doesn't really get the full range of it. The Hebrew word, I'm told it's pronounced something like chokmah. It means so much more than that. It refers to activity, action, in other words. It's knowledge put into action, right? But it also is practical knowledge. Think in terms of skill or applied wisdom. I think about Bezalel and Aholiab over in Exodus, I just forgot the chapter, 31. They were to help Moses with building these utensils for the tabernacle. Some very, very intricate, ornate furniture and furnishings for the tabernacle. And God says they are going to help you with this, but what did God specifically tell Moses? He said, I have placed in them wisdom. That's practical knowledge for what they're going to be doing. expertise, we might even say. Now, wisdom is not just expertise, but that's it's the same Hebrew word that's used here time and time again in the book of Proverbs. So we could say skill, applied knowledge. And so the purpose of the book, again, is to help develop a set of practical skills for living well in God's world. It's not just, again, catchy, memorable sayings, but it's about how to live well in God's world. And by the way, this is linked with another concept that is in the introduction and throughout the book itself, and that is the fear of the Lord. Because, you see, that's the beginning of knowledge. And tied with that, kind of expanding on that, that would be kind of that, I think at least we fall into that category of synthetic parallelism. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. So the fear of the Lord, and we've pointed this out before, it's not just terror, like we might think of that, like we typically use that word fear, but it's a healthy sense of reverence and awe for God and for my place in His world. It's a moral mindset, the fear of the Lord is, that recognizes I'm not God. I'm not God. And I can't make my own definition of what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is evil, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. I can think, I can feel all day long, but that is not the standard because I'm not God. And the fear of the Lord recognizes that. And it's a humbling of oneself before the God of heaven, recognizing His definition of right and wrong, good and evil, even when that's not the easiest choice in the sense of doing the hard things. Even when it's not convenient for me. Is it not a fact that sometimes people, they do what happens to line up with the Bible in many areas, sometimes several areas in their lives, but they're not doing it because they have the fear of the Lord and they want to serve and seek God. They're just doing it because it's what, at the end of the day, it's what they want to do. But the fear of the Lord means I'm humbling myself. I realize I'm not God. I don't make the rules. I live in His world. I humble myself before Him. And even if it means I got to do something that's not easy, even if it means I have to abstain from something that is very tempting, even if it means it's inconvenient for me, I seek Him according to His will because He determines right and wrong, good and evil. That is the fear of the Lord, a healthy, respectful reverence and awe for the Almighty. And so that kind of brings us to this next section. Of course, we're out of time, so we'll pick up there, God willing, next week. And we'll talk about this, get a little bit further into this introductory, or at least this first major section, the first 9 chapters. You're going to see these 10 speeches from a father to his son. And then you get into chapters 10 through 29, and you'll see that's where you have the most of those little short 1 or 2 line proverbs as we think about a proverb. Anything else? I thought, I for some reason, thought I might get through that, that little graphic. But I kind of wondered, I thought it'll either go way longer than I think, or I may just blow through it, but I got to looking at it, I said, there's a lot in that to unpack, just in that graphic itself. See if I can go back here and get you to the zoomed out view. There's a lot going on there, but it's good stuff, and it's a great overview of the book before we start looking at specific topics. But we'll pick up there where we left off, looking at that 10 speeches from a father to a son, Lord willing, next week. Thank you all very much. Appreciate those who offered some thoughts and those who read for us. Thank you.